The first bullet tore through the canvas of her wagon, just as Faith Whitmore was deciding she would never rely on another human being again. That resolution lasted exactly as long as it took for her to realize the Dalton gang had her surrounded in a canyon with no way out, and a broken axle that had stranded her miles from anywhere civilized in the Montana Territory summer of 1876. She pressed herself against the splintered wood, her father's old rifle clutched in trembling hands, and calculated her chances of survival at approximately 0. The second bullet splintered the water barrel, sending precious liquid streaming into the dust, and Faith felt her jaw clench with a fury that burned hotter than fear. She had survived her father's death from consumption 2 winters ago, survived her brother's abandonment when he took off for the California goldfields without a backward glance, survived the banker's attempt to claim her ranch for unpaid debts. She had fought tooth and nail to keep the small spread outside Utica going, selling off cattle one by one until only 6 breeding cows remained, making the trek to Fort Benton alone to trade her mother's silver for seed and supplies. She had promised herself she would never again depend on anyone's strength but her own. Then she heard the hoofbeats coming fast from the north, and a voice that carried like thunder across the canyon walls. "That is enough. Ride out now or stay here permanent." Faith risked a glance through the gap in the canvas and saw him, silhouetted against the brilliant blue sky atop a paint horse that danced sideways with barely contained energy. He wore a dusty black hat pulled low, and even from this distance she could see the rifle he held with the casual confidence of a man who knew exactly how to use it. The Dalton boys, 4 of them ranging in age from maybe 18 to 30, turned their horses to face this new threat. "This is none of your concern, Cowboy," the eldest Dalton called out. His name was Pike, and Faith knew him by reputation as a rustler and a coward who only picked fights he knew he could win. "The lady's got something we want and we aim to take it. The lady looks unwilling to give it." The stranger's voice carried a hint of something that might have been amusement or might have been something far more dangerous. "Which makes it my concern. Now I have asked politely. I will not ask again." Pike Dalton laughed, and his brothers joined in with the nervous bravado of young men who had never truly been tested. Faith watched as Pike reached for his pistol, watched as the movement seemed to happen in slow motion, watched as the stranger moved with a speed that defied belief. The rifle cracked once, and Pike's hat flew off his head, spinning through the air before landing in the sagebrush 20 feet away. "The next one will not be so generous," the stranger said, and now there was no amusement at all in his voice, only cold promise. The Dalton boys looked at each other, looked at their eldest brother's pale face, looked at the stranger who sat his horse like he had all the time in the world. Then they were wheeling their mounts around and thundering back down the canyon, leaving a trail of dust and shouted curses in their wake. Faith stayed pressed against the wagon, her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat. The stranger urged his paint horse forward at a walk, and as he came closer, she could make out more details. He was young, maybe 25 at most, with dark hair that touched his collar and a face that would have been handsome if not for the hard set to his jaw and the wariness in his eyes. Eyes that were an unusual shade of gray-green, like storm clouds over the mountains. He stopped his horse a respectful distance away and touched the brim of his hat. "Madam, are you hurt?" Faith realized she was still pointing her rifle at him and slowly lowered it, though she kept her finger near the trigger. "I am fine. Thank you for your intervention, though I did not require it." She saw something flicker across his face, surprise or perhaps appreciation, and then it was gone behind that careful mask. He glanced at her broken wagon, at the shattered water barrel, at the spare horse she had tied to the back that was now trembling and wild-eyed with fear. "Your axle is split clean through," he observed. "You will not be going anywhere without repairs. The nearest town with a decent wheelwright is Utica, maybe 15 miles south. I am headed that way myself. I would be happy to help you get there." Faith felt her spine stiffen. "I do not need help. I will manage on my own." He studied her for a long moment, and she had the uncomfortable feeling he was seeing far more than she wanted to reveal. Her worn dress that she had mended a dozen times, the shadows under her eyes from too many sleepless nights, the desperation she tried so hard to hide. "The Daltons will likely circle back once they work up their courage again," he said quietly. "They are not smart, but they are persistent, and you have no water." Faith opened her mouth to argue, then closed it again. He was right, damn him. She could feel the Montana sun beating down on her head, could already feel the beginning of thirst scratching at her throat. She had 2 more hours of daylight at best, and she had no idea how to repair a wagon axle even if she had the tools, which she did not. "I said I do not need help," she repeated, but even to her own ears the words sounded hollow. The stranger dismounted in one fluid movement and stood there, holding his horse's reins loosely in one hand. He was tall, she noticed, lean and rangy in the way of men who spent their lives in the saddle. "I heard you," he said, "but maybe the question is not what you need, maybe it is what you want." "I want nothing from anyone." "Fair enough." He paused, and she saw a hint of a smile touch the corner of his mouth. "Then let me be your want." The words hung in the air between them, strange and unexpected and somehow exactly right. Faith stared at him, this stranger who had appeared out of nowhere with his quick hands and his gray-green eyes, and felt something shift inside her chest, something that felt dangerously like hope. "That does not even make sense," she said, but the protest was weak. "Does not have to make sense, just has to be true." He held out his hand. "My name is Xavier Rourke. I am a ranch hand working for the Circle T spread near Utica, and I give you my word that I mean you no harm. Will you let me help you?" Faith looked at his outstretched hand for a long moment. Every instinct she had spent the last 2 years developing screamed at her to refuse, to send him away, to maintain the walls she had built so carefully around herself. But those instincts had not accounted for broken wagon axles and empty water barrels and the Dalton gang circling like wolves. She reached out and took his hand. His palm was calloused and warm, his grip firm but not crushing. "Faith Whitmore, and I suppose I have little choice." "There is always a choice, Miss Whitmore." Xavier released her hand and turned to examine the wagon. "The question is whether you are willing to make the smart one." Faith felt a spark of irritation at his presumption, but she swallowed it down. She needed his help, at least to get to Utica. After that, she could go back to needing no one. She watched as he crouched beside the broken axle, running his fingers over the split wood with the careful attention of someone who understood how things worked. "This cannot be fixed in the field," he said after a moment. "We will need to transfer your goods to my horse and yours, leave the wagon here and come back for it once we have a replacement axle made. What are you carrying?" "Seed corn, a few sacks of flour, some tools." Faith hesitated. "And my personal belongings." Xavier straightened and looked at her. "We will take it all. The seed corn is most important if you are trying to make a go of a ranch. The rest we can prioritize by weight and necessity." They worked in silence as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, transferring sacks and crates from the wagon to the horses. Xavier moved with an economy of motion that spoke of long practice, and Faith found herself watching him when she thought he was not looking. There was something about him that did not quite fit the image of a simple ranch hand. The way he carried himself, the quality of his boots, the rifle that was finer than anything most cowboys could afford. "You are staring," Xavier said without looking up from the rope. He was securing around a bundle of supplies. Faith felt heat rise to her cheeks. "I am merely wondering why a man with a rifle like that is working as a ranch hand." Now he did look at her, and she saw amusement in those storm cloud eyes. "And I am wondering why a woman who clearly grew up with more than she has now is trying to run a ranch alone." "We all have our stories, Miss Whitmore. Then perhaps we should keep them to ourselves. Perhaps we should." But he said it with a gentleness that took the sting out of the words. By the time they had finished loading the horses, the sun was painting the canyon walls in shades of orange and gold. Xavier insisted on giving Faith his paint horse to ride while he took her spare, a sturdy sorrel mare named Clover. Faith wanted to argue but recognized the practicality of his decision. His horse was calmer and better trained, and she was exhausted in a way that went bone deep. They rode south toward Utica as the stars began to emerge overhead, and Faith found herself stealing glances at the man riding beside her. Xavier sat his horse with the relaxed grace of someone who had been born in the saddle, his eyes constantly scanning the landscape around them. She noticed he kept his right hand near the rifle scabbard, ready but not tense. "How long have you been working for the Circle T?" she asked, as much to break the silence as from genuine curiosity. "3 months. I drift from place to place, work where I am needed, move on when the season changes." "That sounds lonely." Xavier turned to look at her, and in the gathering darkness his eyes seemed almost luminous. "It is, but it is also simple. No ties, no obligations, no one depending on you." Faith understood that in a way she suspected he would not appreciate. "And no one to depend on either." "Exactly." He paused. "What happened to your ranch, Miss Whitmore? Forgive the forwardness, but it is clear you are struggling." Faith felt the automatic defense rise in her throat, the instinct to tell him it was none of his business. But something about the darkness and the exhaustion and the strange intimacy of riding through the night together loosened her tongue. "My father died. My brother left. I was left with debts I did not know existed and cattle that kept disappearing in the night. I have been fighting to keep the land for 2 years now, and I am losing." She said it flatly, without emotion, because emotion would break her. "This trip to Fort Benton was my last chance. I traded the last valuable thing I owned for seed corn. If I can get a crop in the ground and through the summer, I might be able to sell enough to make the loan payment. If not, the bank will take everything." "What about hired help?" Faith laughed, and it came out bitter. "With what money? I cannot even afford to pay myself, let alone someone else." "There are men who would work for room and board and a share of the profits. There are also men who would take advantage of a woman alone, or worse. I learned that lesson the hard way." Faith said it with a finality that she hoped would end the conversation. Xavier was quiet for a long moment. Then, "The foreman at the Circle T, his brother has the spread next to yours. Name is John Winters. He mentioned a while back that your fences were falling down. John Winters is a gossip and a busybody, but he is not wrong. I have been using whatever wood I can scavenge to patch them, but it is like trying to hold back a flood with a bucket. The Circle T has extra fence posts. Boss was planning to sell them to the railroad crew, but he might be willing to let you have them at cost if I asked." Faith pulled on the reins, bringing Xavier's paint horse to a stop. Xavier stopped beside her, his expression questioning in the moonlight that had risen full and bright. "Why would you do that?" Faith demanded. "You do not know me. You have no reason to help me beyond getting me to Utica, which I am grateful for, but this is more than that." "What do you want?" Xavier met her eyes steadily. "I want nothing, Miss Whitmore, but I see someone fighting hard to keep something that matters to them, and I respect that. If I can make that fight a little easier, why should I not? Because people do not help without expecting something in return. That is how the world works. Maybe that has been your experience, but it does not have to be the rule. Xavier urged his horse forward again, not waiting for her response. Faith sat there for a moment, torn between frustration and something that felt dangerously like gratitude. Then she touched her heels to the paint sides and followed. They reached Utica just after midnight, when the town was dark except for the saloon at the far end of the main street and a few lit windows in the hotel. It was a small settlement, maybe 300 people at most, built up around a creek that ran year-round and provided water for the ranches scattered across the valley. Faith had been here a handful of times, always keeping to herself, always aware of the pitying looks from the townspeople who knew her story. Xavier led them to the livery stable, where an old man named Hank agreed to put up their horses and guard their supplies for 2 bits. Then he turned to Faith with a question in his eyes. "The hotel has rooms available. You should get some rest." Faith thought of her empty purse, the few coins she had left that would need to stretch impossibly far. "I will sleep in the livery. I have done it before." "No, you will not." Xavier's voice was firm. "I will get 2 rooms. You can pay me back if it makes you feel better, but you are not sleeping in a stable. I cannot afford the hotel, and I will not accept charity. It is not charity. It is basic human decency, and if it troubles you so much, consider it a loan." Xavier was already walking toward the hotel, clearly expecting her to follow. Faith stood there in the street, her hands clenched into fists at her sides, torn between pride and practicality. Finally, practicality won. She was exhausted, hungry, and covered in trail dust. A real bed and maybe a basin to wash in sounded like heaven, even if it meant swallowing her pride. The hotel was run by a woman named Mrs. Chen, who had come to Montana from San Francisco and had a reputation for keeping the cleanest rooms in town. She looked at Faith with sharp eyes that saw too much but said nothing, merely handed over 2 keys and pointed up the stairs. "Breakfast is at 7. Bath water is extra if you want it hot." Faith's room was small but immaculate, with a narrow bed covered in a worn but clean quilt, a washstand with a pitcher and basin, and a window that looked out over the main street. She sank down on the edge of the bed and put her face in her hands, feeling the exhaustion of the day crash over her like a wave. There was a soft knock on the door. "Miss Whitmore, I am going to get some food from the saloon. May I bring you something?" Faith wanted to say no, wanted to send Xavier Rourke away and rebuild the walls he seemed to be dismantling with nothing more than simple kindness. But her stomach was a hollow ache, and she could not remember the last time she had eaten. "Yes," she called through the door. "Thank you." She heard his footsteps retreating down the hall, and then she was alone with her thoughts. Who was Xavier Rourke, really? Why had he appeared at exactly the moment she needed help? And why did the idea of accepting that help feel both terrifying and like the first deep breath she had taken in months? Xavier returned 20 minutes later with plates of stew and fresh bread wrapped in cloth. Faith had washed her face and hands and taken down her hair from the tight bun she always wore, and she saw something flicker in his eyes when she opened the door. Surprise, maybe, or appreciation. The cook at the saloon is a former cavalryman. His stew is the best in 3 counties. Xavier handed her a plate, and the smell made her mouth water. They sat on opposite sides of the small room, she on the bed and he in the single chair, eating in a silence that was surprisingly comfortable. The stew was rich and thick with meat and vegetables, and the bread was still warm from the oven. Faith ate with the single-minded focus of someone who had been rationing food for too long. "When did you last have a decent meal?" Xavier asked quietly. Faith set down her empty plate. "That is not your concern. Perhaps not, but I am going to make it my concern anyway." He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his eyes serious. "Miss Whitmore, Faith, I know you said you do not need anyone, but everyone needs someone sometime. There is no shame in accepting help when it is offered freely. You do not understand. I have relied on people before. My father promised he would always take care of the ranch, and then he got sick and died. My brother promised he would stay and help me, and then he left in the middle of the night with half the money from the cattle sale. The bank manager promised he would give me time to pay back the loan, and then he tried to force me to marry him as payment." Faith heard her voice rising and forced it back down. "Everyone leaves. Everyone takes. I am better off alone." Xavier was quiet for a long moment, his eyes never leaving her face. Then he said, "I am sorry those things happened to you, and you are right, I do not fully understand. But I do know that closing yourself off from help is a sure way to go down alone, and going down alone is still going down. So what do you suggest? That I trust you, a stranger who appeared out of nowhere, that I let down my guard and risk being hurt again? I suggest you consider the possibility that not everyone is out to hurt you, that some people offer help because it is the right thing to do, not because they expect something in return." Xavier stood and moved toward the door. "Get some rest, Miss Whitmore. In the morning, we will get your wagon axle fixed and figure out how to get you home. After that, if you never want to see me again, I will respect that. But until then, let me help, please." He was gone before she could respond, the door clicking shut softly behind him. Faith sat there on the bed, her plate empty and her mind churning. "Then let me be your want." The words echoed in her head, strange and powerful and impossible to ignore. She lay down on the bed without undressing and stared at the ceiling until exhaustion finally pulled her under. Morning came too quickly, announced by golden sunlight streaming through the window and the sound of wagons rattling past on the street below. Faith washed her face and braided her hair, pulling on the same worn dress she had traveled in because it was the only one she had. When she came downstairs, she found Xavier already seated in the small dining room talking quietly with Mrs. Chen. "Good morning," he said, rising as she approached. "I hope you slept well." "Well enough." Faith sat down at the table, acutely aware of how shabby she must look next to him. Xavier had clearly taken advantage of the bathhouse, his dark hair still damp and his jaw freshly shaved. He wore clean clothes, and she noticed again the quality of the fabric, too fine for an ordinary ranch hand. Mrs. Chen brought coffee and plates of eggs and bacon, and Faith forced herself to eat slowly despite her hunger. Xavier was watching her again with that disconcerting directness. "I spoke to the wheelwright this morning," he said. "His name is Tom Gardner, and he says he can have a new axle made by tomorrow afternoon. I also spoke to Hank at the livery, and he is willing to take his wagon out to retrieve yours and bring it back here for repairs. The whole thing will cost about $10. Faith felt her stomach clench. $10 was more than she had, more than she would have even if she sold everything she owned except the ranch itself. "I do not have $10, she said flatly. "I know. I am loaning it to you. And how exactly do you expect me to pay you back?" Xavier took a sip of his coffee, his eyes never leaving hers. "I am not worried about it. Pay me back when you can, or do not pay me back at all. It does not matter to me. It matters to me." Faith set down her fork with more force than necessary. "I am not a charity case, Mr. Rourke. I will pay you back every cent, with interest if necessary, but I need to know why you are doing this. What do you want from me?" "I want nothing from you." That is not an answer. Xavier sighed and set down his own cup. Fine, you want the truth. I am doing this because I see myself in you. The stubbornness, the pride, the determination to prove you do not need anyone. I have lived that way for 5 years now since I left home and struck out on my own. And I can tell you from experience that it is a lonely, hard way to live. So maybe I am helping you because I wish someone had helped me. Is that answer enough? Faith stared at him, taken aback by his honesty. Why did you leave home? That is a story for another time if there is another time. Xavier stood. I need to go back to the Circle T and let my boss know I will be away for a few days. You are welcome to stay here in town, or if you prefer, you can ride back to your ranch and I will bring the repaired wagon to you when it is ready. I should go back. The cattle need tending, and I have been away too long already. Then I will ride with you. It is on my way. Faith wanted to argue to tell him she could manage the 15 miles to her ranch alone, but the truth was she would feel safer with him beside her. The Dalton gang was still out there, and while they were cowards, they were dangerous cowards. They left Utica an hour later, after Xavier had made arrangements with Tom Gardner and paid him half the money up front. Faith rode the sorrel mare this time while Xavier took his paint horse, and they made good time across the open grassland that stretched between the town and her ranch. The Whitmore ranch sat in a small valley carved out by a tributary of the creek, protected on 3 sides by low hills covered in pine and aspen. The ranch house was small, just 4 rooms built by her father 20 years ago when he had first claimed the land. The barn needed a new roof, and the corrals were held together more by hope than actual structural integrity. But it was hers, and Faith loved it with a fierceness that surprised even her. Xavier pulled up his horse as they crested the last hill and looked down at the spread below. She tried to see it through his eyes, the peeling paint and sagging fences and general air of desperation, and felt shame burn in her chest. It is not much, she said defensively. It has good bones. Good water, decent grazing, timber for building. With some work it could be profitable again. With money and help, you mean, both of which I do not have. Xavier urged his horse forward. Let me see the rest of it. They spent the next 2 hours riding the boundaries of her land, while Faith pointed out the fence lines that needed repair. The pasture where her 6 remaining cows grazed, the field where she hoped to plant the seed corn. Xavier asked questions that showed he knew ranching, really knew it in a way that went beyond being a simple hired hand. You have maybe 160 acres here, most of it usable, he said as they stopped at the creek to water the horses. If you could get the fences secure and the field planted, you could support 50 head of cattle easily, maybe more. The problem is capital. You need money to make money. Thank you for that brilliant observation. Faith dismounted and knelt by the creek, cupping water in her hands to drink. It was cold and clear, tasting of snowmelt and stone. Xavier got down from his horse and came to stand beside her. I am not trying to discourage you. I am trying to figure out a solution. There is no solution. Not unless you happen to have $500 tucked away somewhere, which I doubt. No, I do not, but I have something else. Time, skill, and a willingness to work. Xavier crouched beside her, his eyes on the water flowing past. What if I helped you? Worked your ranch in exchange for room and board and a percentage of the profits when you sell your cattle? Faith stood abruptly. Absolutely not. Why not? It solves your problem. It creates more problems than it solves. I told you, I do not need a partner or a hired hand or whatever you think you are offering. And I told you, let me be your want. Xavier stood as well, and suddenly they were very close, close enough that Faith could see the tiny scar above his left eyebrow and the flecks of darker green in his gray eyes. I am not asking you to need me, Faith. I am asking you to want my help. There is a difference. Not to me. But even as she said it, Faith felt the words ring hollow. She did want his help, wanted it desperately, and that terrified her more than anything the Dalton gang could have done. Think about it, Xavier said quietly. I need to get back to the Circle T and collect my wages and my things. I will bring your wagon here tomorrow evening. You have until then to decide. He mounted his paint horse in one smooth motion and touched the brim of his hat to her. Then he was riding back the way they had come, leaving Faith standing by the creek with her thoughts in turmoil. That night, alone in the ranch house that felt too big and too empty, Faith made herself face the truth. She could not do this alone. She had been trying for 2 years and she was failing. The cattle were disappearing, the fences were falling apart, and she was one bad winter or one more disaster away from losing everything. She could accept Xavier's help and risk being hurt again, or she could cling to her pride and watch her father's legacy slip away. When she finally fell asleep, she dreamed of storm cloud eyes and a voice saying, "Then let me be your want." Xavier arrived the next evening just as the sun was setting, driving her repaired wagon with his paint horse tied to the back. Faith came out of the barn where she had been trying to fix a broken stall door and stood watching as he pulled up in front of the house. "Tom Gardner does good work," Xavier said, hopping down from the wagon seat. "This axle will last another 10 years at least. How much do I owe you?" Faith asked because it was easier than saying what she really wanted to say. "We can settle accounts later. Right now, I am more interested in your answer. Have you thought about my offer?" Faith took a breath and made herself meet his eyes. "I have, and against my better judgment I accept. You can stay in the bunkhouse, work the ranch, and take 20% of profits when we sell cattle, but there are conditions." "Of course there are." Xavier's mouth quirked in what might have been amusement. "What are they?" "First, this is strictly a business arrangement. You work, I work. We rebuild this ranch together, but that is all it is. Second, if at any point I decide this is not working, you leave. No questions and no arguments. Third, you tell me the truth about who you really are, because we both know you are not just a ranch hand." Xavier was quiet for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he nodded slowly. "Fair enough. I can agree to those terms, though I reserve the right to argue with the first one if circumstances change. They will not. We will see." Xavier held out his hand. "Do we have a deal?" Faith looked at his outstretched hand, remembering the last time they had shaken, how his palm had been warm and calloused and somehow reassuring. She reached out and clasped his hand firmly. "We have a deal. Now start talking. Who are you, Xavier Rourke?" Xavier released her hand and leaned back against the wagon, his eyes on the darkening sky. "I am exactly who I said I am. A man who drifts from place to place, working where I am needed. But you are right that I was not always a ranch hand. I grew up in Virginia, on a horse farm that my family had owned for 3 generations. My father bred some of the finest thoroughbreds in the state, sold them to wealthy men who raced them and made fortunes. I was supposed to take over the business when I was old enough. What happened?" "The war happened." Xavier's voice was flat. "My father sided with the Confederacy, and when it ended, everything was gone. The horses were sold or stolen, the land was seized for back taxes, and my father drank himself to death within a year. My mother remarried, a northern businessman who made it clear I was not welcome. So I left, worked my way west doing whatever I could find. Turns out I am good with horses and cattle, and there is always work for men with those skills." Faith heard the pain beneath the carefully neutral words. "I am sorry. I know what it is like to lose everything." "I know you do. That is why I want to help you keep what you have left." Xavier straightened. "So where is this bunkhouse you mentioned?" The bunkhouse was a small structure behind the barn, with 4 cots and a potbelly stove and not much else. It had been built for hired hands during the times when her father could afford them, but it had stood empty for 2 years. Faith watched as Xavier set his saddlebags on one of the cots and looked around with an expression that suggested he had stayed in far worse places. "It will do. I have slept in lined shacks and under bridges. This is luxury. There are blankets in the chest at the end. I will bring you some food." "You do not need to wait on me, Faith. I can cook for myself." It was the first time he had used her given name without the miss attached, and hearing it in his low voice sent an unexpected shiver down her spine. Faith turned away before he could see her reaction. "I am not waiting on you. I am feeding my business partner. There is a difference." She hurried back to the main house before he could respond, her heart beating faster than it should. This was a mistake, she told herself. Letting Xavier Rourke into her life, even in this limited capacity, was going to lead to complications she did not need. But when she thought about facing the work ahead alone, the alternative seemed even worse. They fell into a routine over the next few weeks that was both comfortable and strange. Xavier rose before dawn to check on the cattle and mend fences, and Faith worked on preparing the field for planting. They ate meals together, simple fare of beans and bacon and whatever vegetables she had managed to coax from the small garden behind the house. They talked about the work that needed doing, about cattle prices and weather patterns and the best way to brace a fence post. What they did not talk about was anything personal. Faith kept her end of the bargain, maintaining the boundaries she had set, treating Xavier as nothing more than a hired hand, despite the fact that they both knew he was much more than that. And Xavier, for his part, seemed content to let her keep her distance, even as she caught him watching her sometimes with an expression she could not quite read. The seed corn went into the ground in late May, when the soil was finally warm enough and the threat of late frost had passed. Faith and Xavier worked side by side, plowing furrows and dropping seeds and covering them with earth. And by the time they finished, Faith's back ached and her hands were raw, but she felt a satisfaction she had not experienced in longer than she could remember. "That is a good day's work," Xavier said, standing at the edge of the field and surveying what they had accomplished. "If the weather holds and we get decent rain, you will have a fine crop come fall." "We will have a fine crop," Faith corrected. "You are part of this now." Xavier turned to look at her, and something in his expression made her breath catch. "Yes, I suppose I am." That night, as Faith lay in her narrow bed listening to the sounds of the ranch settling around her, she allowed herself to acknowledge what she had been trying to ignore. She was developing feelings for Xavier Rourke, feelings that went far beyond gratitude or professional respect. She found herself looking forward to meals together, to the sound of his voice, to the rare smiles that transformed his serious face into something almost boyish. She noticed the way he moved with unconscious grace, the way his hands were gentle with the horses, the way he had started to hum while he worked. It terrified her. June brought heat and afternoon thunderstorms that rolled across the valley with dramatic fury. The corn sprouted and grew, tender green shoots pushing through the dark earth, and Faith checked it obsessively, worried about insects or blight or any of the 100 things that could go wrong. Xavier teased her about it gently, but she noticed he checked the field almost as often as she did. The cattle were thriving on the good spring grass, and Xavier suggested they think about buying a few more head to increase the herd. Faith wanted to, but the numbers did not work. Every penny she had was tied up in supplies and loan payments. What about the Circle T? She asked one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sun set. It had become a habit, This quiet time at the end of the day when they were both too tired to work but not quite ready to sleep. Are they still willing to sell fence posts? I will ride over tomorrow and ask. The boss owes me back wages anyway. Faith hesitated, then said, You have been here almost a month now. Are you regretting your decision? Xavier turned to look at her, his face half in shadow. Not even for a moment. Are you regretting letting me stay? No, Faith admitted. Though I probably should. Why is that? Because I am starting to care about you, and caring about people only leads to pain. But Faith could not say that out loud, so instead she said, Because it goes against every instinct I have developed. Because trusting people has never worked out well for me, because I am afraid. Of me. Of what you represent, change, dependence, the possibility of losing something I have begun to value. Xavier was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, I am afraid too, if it helps. Of what? Of the same things. I have spent 5 years learning to rely only on myself, learning not to need anyone or let anyone need me. And then I met you, and suddenly all those carefully constructed walls are not as solid as I thought. He stood abruptly. I should let you rest. Morning comes early. He was gone before Faith could respond, disappearing into the darkness toward the bunkhouse, and she sat there alone on the porch trying to make sense of the emotions churning inside her. Xavier rode to the Circle T the next morning and returned with surprising news. The ranch had sold its entire herd to a cattle buyer from Chicago and was shutting down operations. The owner, an elderly man named Thomas Carlyle, was returning east to live with his daughter, and the ranch was being sold. He offered me a permanent position managing the new owner's herd, Xavier said as he unsaddled his paint horse. Good wages, a percentage of the profits, a house to live in. Faith felt her stomach drop. That sounds like an excellent opportunity. When do you leave? Xavier looked at her with an expression she could not read. I turned it down. Why would you do that? That is exactly the kind of position you should want. Stable, profitable, permanent. Because I made a commitment here. Because we have work to finish. Because I do not want to leave. Xavier said the last part quietly, his eyes locked on hers. Faith felt her heart hammering. Xavier, I cannot ask you to give up an opportunity like that for me. You did not ask, I chose. There is a difference. He closed the distance between them. Faith, I know you set boundaries when I agreed to work here. I know you said this was strictly business, but I need you to know that it stopped being just business for me weeks ago. I care about you. I care about this ranch. I care about what we are building together. And I am not ready to walk away from that. Faith stared at him, her mind reeling. Part of her wanted to run, to retreat behind the walls she had built so carefully. But another part, a part that was growing stronger every day, wanted to step forward to close the distance between them, to take the risk. I do not know how to do this, she whispered. I do not know how to trust someone again. Then learn with me. We will figure it out together. Xavier reached out and gently tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his fingers lingering on her cheek. I am not asking for promises or commitments. I am just asking for a chance. Faith closed her eyes, feeling the warmth of his hand against her skin. Then she opened them and met his gaze. What about the fence posts? Xavier blinked, clearly thrown by the change of subject. Then he laughed, a genuine sound of amusement that transformed his face. Thomas is willing to sell them to you for cost, and he will deliver them himself as a goodbye gift. He always liked your father. That is generous of him. He is a good man. There are more of them in the world than you think. Xavier let his hand drop but did not step back. Faith, you do not have to give me an answer right now about anything other than work, but I want you to know where I stand. I want more than a business arrangement. I want to be part of your life, not just your ranch. Before Faith could respond, Before she could think better of it, she leaned forward and kissed him. It was brief and chaste, barely more than a press of lips, but it felt like jumping off a cliff. Xavier went very still. Then his hands came up to frame her face, gentle and sure, and he kissed her back with a tenderness that made her throat tight with emotion. When they finally pulled apart, Faith was trembling. "That was probably a mistake," she said. "Probably." Xavier rested his forehead against hers. "Are you planning to regret it?" "I am planning to try not to." Faith took a shaky breath. "This is terrifying." "I know. But we do not have to do it all at once. We can take it slow, one day at a time." "One day at a time," Faith repeated, and it felt like a promise. The fence posts arrived 3 days later, delivered by Thomas Carlyle himself in a heavily loaded wagon. He was a tall man in his late 60s with white hair and kind eyes, and he spent an hour walking the property with Faith and Xavier, offering advice and stories about the early days when Montana was still wild territory. "Your father was a good neighbor," Thomas told Faith as he prepared to leave. "He helped me through some hard times when I first came here. I am glad to be able to return the favor, even in this small way. You take care of this place and take care of each other." After he left, Faith and Xavier stood looking at the pile of fence posts, and Faith felt something like hope bloom in her chest. With these, they could repair the worst of the fences. They could make the ranch secure again. They could build something that would last. They spent the next 2 weeks working on the fences, digging post holes and setting poles and stringing wire. It was hard physical labor that left them exhausted by the end of each day, but there was satisfaction in it too. Faith found herself working alongside Xavier in a companionable silence that felt deeper than words, their movements synchronized in a way that spoke of growing trust. And in the evenings, after supper, they would sit on the porch and talk. Xavier told her about his childhood in Virginia, about learning to ride almost before he could walk, about the magnificent horses his father had bred. Faith told him about growing up on the ranch, about her mother's death when she was 12, about the dreams she had once had of expanding the herd and building a real home. "You can still have those dreams," Xavier said one night, his hand finding hers in the darkness. "Maybe. If the corn crop comes in, if we can buy more cattle, if nothing goes wrong. That is a lot of ifs. That is ranching." But Faith laced her fingers through his and held on. July brought intense heat and the constant work of maintaining the crops and the cattle. The corn grew tall, the stalks thick and healthy, and Faith found herself checking it every morning with a mixture of pride and anxiety. Everything depended on this crop. Everything. Xavier had started sleeping in the main house, in the spare room that had once been her brother's. It had happened gradually, naturally, after a night when a summer storm had torn part of the roof off the bunkhouse, and Xavier had been soaked trying to save his belongings. Faith had insisted he take the spare room, just until the roof was fixed, and somehow he had never moved back out. Neither of them mentioned it. It just became the new normal. They were sitting at the kitchen table one evening going over the accounts when Xavier said, "We need to talk about the Daltons." Faith looked up sharply. "What about them?" "I saw signs today when I was checking the north fence line. Someone has been watching the ranch. Tracks in the soft ground near the creek, cigarette butts that are fresh. I think they are planning something." Faith felt cold despite the summer heat. "Are you sure it is them?" "Not certain, but it seems likely. We humiliated them, Faith. Men like that do not forget." Xavier closed the ledger he had been studying. "I think we need to be prepared for trouble." "What kind of preparation?" "Extra vigilance. Keep the rifles loaded and close. Maybe reach out to the sheriff in Utica, let him know there might be a problem." Faith nodded, her mind already racing. She had known the Daltons would not just disappear, but she had been so focused on the ranch work that she had let herself forget the danger. That was foolish, and she should have known better. That night Faith could not sleep. She lay in her bed listening to the sounds of the house, every creak and groan amplified by her anxiety. Finally, around 2 in the morning, she got up and padded barefoot to the kitchen for water. Xavier was sitting at the table, still dressed, his rifle within easy reach. He looked up as she entered and gave her a tired smile. Could not sleep either, too many thoughts. Faith sat down across from him. "You should rest. You cannot stay up all night." "I will rest when I know you are safe." Xavier leaned back in his chair. "Besides, I have never needed much sleep." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment. Then Faith said, "Thank you for everything, for staying, for helping, for caring. I know I have not made it easy." "Nothing worthwhile is easy." Xavier reached across the table and took her hand. "And you are very much worthwhile, Faith Whitmore." Faith felt tears prick her eyes, sudden and unexpected. "I am falling in love with you, and it scares me to death." Xavier's eyes widened. Then he was moving around the table, pulling her up into his arms, holding her close while she tried not to cry. "I am already in love with you," he murmured against her hair. "Have been for weeks, maybe since that first day when you pointed a rifle at me and told me you did not need my help. That is a strange thing to fall in love with. Maybe, but it is true nonetheless." Xavier pulled back just enough to look at her face. "I love your strength and your stubbornness and your determination. I love the way you care for this ranch like it is a living thing. I love the way you try so hard to be independent but secretly want someone to lean on. I love all of it, all of you." Faith reached up and cupped his face in her hands. "If you break my heart, Xavier Rourke, I will never forgive you. Then I will spend every day of my life making sure I do not." He kissed her then, deep and sweet and full of promise, and Faith let herself fall into it without reservation. They spent the rest of that night talking, really talking about the future they might build together, about dreams and fears and the life they wanted. When dawn came, Faith felt something she had not experienced in years. Genuine hope for tomorrow. The Daltons made their move 3 nights later. Faith woke to the sound of breaking glass and the smell of smoke. She was out of bed in an instant, grabbing her rifle and running for the door. Xavier was already in the hallway, his own weapon in hand and his face grim. "The barn," he said. They set fire to the barn. They ran outside together to find the barn fully engulfed, flames shooting up into the night sky. Faith's mind immediately went to the horses, but Xavier was already running toward the structure, and she had no choice but to follow. The heat was intense, almost unbearable, but Xavier plunged through the door and Faith went after him. The horses were screaming with terror, their eyes rolling white in the smoke and flame. Xavier started opening stall doors, slapping the animals on the hindquarters to drive them out while Faith did the same on the other side of the barn. They had just gotten the last horse out when they heard the laughter. Pike Dalton and his 3 brothers stood in a semicircle near the house, outlined by the fire's glow, their faces twisted with ugly satisfaction. "Thought you could make fools of us," Pike called out. "Thought there would not be consequences. We are taking what is ours, starting with this whole damned place." Xavier raised his rifle but did not fire. "Leave now and we will call it even. Stay and this ends badly for you." 4 against 2, one of the younger Daltons said. "I like those odds." What happened next occurred so quickly that Faith almost could not follow it. Xavier moved like lightning, his rifle cracking twice in rapid succession, and 2 of the Dalton boys dropped their weapons with cries of pain. Not dead, Faith realized, but wounded, shot in the shoulder or arm with precision that spoke of long practice. Pike and the remaining brothers started firing wildly, and Faith felt something burn across her upper arm. She ignored it and raised her own rifle, firing once, and Pike's hat went flying just as it had that first day in the canyon. The message was clear. The next shot would not miss. "You need to leave," Xavier said, his voice deadly calm. "Right now." The Daltons looked at their wounded brothers, looked at Xavier's steady rifle, looked at Faith, who stood beside him with her own weapon raised despite the blood running down her arm. Then they were scrambling for their horses, dragging their injured siblings with them and disappearing into the night. The moment they were gone, Xavier turned to Faith. "You are bleeding. It is just a graze. The barn, Xavier, we have to save what we can." But it was already too late. The barn was a total loss, collapsing in on itself with a roar of flame and falling timber. All they could do was watch it burn and make sure the fire did not spread to the house or the other buildings. By the time the sun rose, the barn was nothing but smoking ruins. The horses had scattered but were slowly coming back, drawn by familiarity and thirst. Faith's arm had been bandaged with strips torn from Xavier's shirt, and they sat on the porch steps, exhausted and covered in soot, surveying the damage. "This is not how I imagined things going," Faith said, and was surprised to hear herself laugh. It was either that or cry, and she had done enough crying to last a lifetime. Xavier put his arm around her shoulders. "We will rebuild. The important things are safe. The horses, the cattle, the house, the corn, and each other. The barn will take months to rebuild, and money we do not have. Then we start small. A lean-to for the horses, something to get us through the winter. And in the spring, when we sell the corn and the calves, we build it right." Xavier pressed a kiss to her temple. "We are going to be fine, Faith, I promise you that." Faith leaned into him, letting herself take comfort from his solid presence. "I love you. I love you too. Now let me look at that arm again. I want to make sure it is clean." They rode into Utica later that morning to report the fire and the attack to Sheriff Harrison, a pragmatic man in his 50s who listened to their story with grim attention. He promised to send a deputy to look for the Daltons, though he admitted that they were probably already long gone. "They will likely not come back, not after this," Harrison said. "But you should stay alert nonetheless. Men like that sometimes develop grudges." Faith and Xavier stopped at the general store to buy supplies for rebuilding, and Faith noticed the way the townspeople looked at them. With respect, she realized. They had stood up to the Daltons, had protected their own, and that meant something in a place like Montana Territory where survival often depended on courage. Mrs. Chen stopped them on the street as they were loading their wagon. "I heard about the fire. That is terrible news. If you need anything, a place to stay or meals, you let me know." "Thank you," Faith said, touched by the offer. "We will manage, but I appreciate it." "That young man of yours is a keeper," Mrs. Chen said, nodding toward Xavier, who was securing the load. "You hold on to him." "I intend to," Faith replied, and meant it with every fiber of her being. They spent the rest of July and all of August working on a makeshift shelter for the horses and repairing the damage from the fire. It was hard work, made harder by the summer heat, but they worked side by side from sunup to sundown, and Faith found a joy in it that surprised her. This was partnership, she realized. This was what it meant to build something together, to share the burdens and the triumphs equally. The corn grew tall and strong, and by late August the ears were filling out, heavy with promise. Faith walked through the field in the early morning, running her hands over the stalks, and let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, they were going to make it. One evening in early September, as they sat on the porch watching the stars come out, Xavier said, "Marry me." Faith turned to stare at him. "What? Marry me, be my wife. Let me be your husband, build this life with me officially, legally, permanently." Xavier took her hand. "I know it is fast. I know we have only known each other a few months, but I also know that I love you more than I thought it was possible to love anyone, and I want to spend the rest of my life proving that to you." Faith felt her throat tighten with emotion. "Yes, yes, yes, I will marry you, Xavier Rourke. Yes to all of it." Faith laughed and threw her arms around him. "Yes, yes, yes." Xavier kissed her then, deep and thorough and full of promise, and when they finally pulled apart they were both grinning like fools. "We should probably discuss logistics," Xavier said, though he did not let go of her. "Do you want a big wedding? A church ceremony? I do not have much experience with this sort of thing." "Neither do I. I always imagined something simple, just us and maybe a few friends, a judge to make it legal." Faith rested her head on his shoulder. "I do not need a fancy dress or a big party, I just need you. Then that is what we will do, simple and perfect." Xavier pressed a kiss to her hair. "How does next month sound, after we harvest the corn and have some money coming in?" "Next month sounds wonderful." They were married on a cool October morning in Utica, in the parlor of Mrs. Chen's hotel with Sheriff Harrison standing as witness. Faith wore her best dress, mended and pressed, with wildflowers in her hair that Xavier had picked that morning. Xavier wore clean clothes and a new hat purchased specially for the occasion. The judge, an elderly man named Sawyer, performed a short ceremony that was more practical than romantic, but somehow perfect in its simplicity. When he pronounced them husband and wife, Xavier kissed Faith with a tenderness that made her eyes sting with happy tears. They signed the papers making it legal, and then Mrs. Chen insisted on hosting a small celebration with cake and tea. "You two are good people," she said, raising a teacup in toast. "I wish you every happiness." "Thank you," Faith said, finding Xavier's hand and holding tight, "for everything." They rode back to the ranch in the afternoon, husband and wife now, and the world looked different somehow. Brighter. More full of possibility. The corn had been harvested the week before, yielding better than Faith had dared hope. They had already sold most of it to a grain merchant passing through, and the money was sitting in the bank, enough to pay the loan and have plenty left over for winter supplies and seed for next year. "We did it," Faith said as they crested the hill and looked down at their ranch. "We actually did it." "You did it," Xavier corrected. "I just helped." "No, we did it together." Faith turned to him. "I could not have done it without you, Xavier. I know I said I needed no one, but the truth is I needed you. I just did not know it yet. And I am very glad you let me be your want." Xavier dismounted and came to help her down, his hands settling on her waist. "Now, Mrs. Rourke, what do you say we go start our life together?" "I say yes to that, too." That winter was cold but not unbearable, and Faith and Xavier spent it planning for the spring. They used some of the corn money to buy 10 more cows, carefully selected breeding stock that would help rebuild the herd. Xavier drew up plans for a new barn, larger and better designed than the old one, that they would build when the weather warmed. They also discovered in late November that Faith was expecting a baby. "Are you sure?" Xavier asked, his face a mixture of joy and terror. "As sure as I can be without seeing a doctor, but all the signs are there." Faith took his hand and placed it on her still flat stomach. "We are going to be parents, Xavier." Xavier pulled her into his arms and held her like she was made of glass. "I am going to be a father." "I do not know how to be a father." "Then we will learn together, just like everything else." Faith pulled back to look at him. "Are you happy?" "Happy does not even begin to cover it." Xavier kissed her softly. "Terrified, overwhelmed, and happier than I have ever been in my entire life." The baby, a boy they named Thomas after Thomas Carlyle, who had helped them in their time of need, was born in early July during a thunderstorm that seemed to shake the very foundations of the house. Faith labored for 12 hours with Xavier beside her, holding her hand and whispering encouragement. And when the baby finally arrived, howling his displeasure at the world, Faith thought her heart might burst with love. "He is perfect," Xavier said, cradling his son with a reverence that brought tears to Faith's eyes. "He has your nose, and your eyes. Look, they are that same gray-green." They named him Thomas Xavier Rourke, and he became the center of their world. Faith marveled at how Xavier took to fatherhood, patient and gentle and endlessly devoted. He would walk the floor with Thomas in the middle of the night, singing old Virginia lullabies in his low voice, and Faith would watch from the bedroom doorway and think about how much her life had changed in the span of 2 years. The new barn went up that fall, a community effort with neighbors from surrounding ranches coming to help with the raising. It was larger than the old one, with proper stalls and a loft for hay storage, and Faith stood beside Xavier on the day they finished it, Thomas asleep in a sling against her chest, and felt a sense of accomplishment that was almost overwhelming. "Your father would be proud," Xavier said quietly. "Of all of this, of you." "I think he would be proud of us," Faith corrected. "This is ours, Xavier. We built this together." The years that followed were good ones, full of hard work and simple joys. The ranch prospered under their joint management, the herd growing to 70 head of cattle. They added horses too, breeding stock purchased from a ranch in Wyoming, and Xavier's skill with training them became locally famous. People started coming from miles around to buy Rourke-trained horses, and the additional income allowed them to make improvements to the house and the land. Thomas grew into a sturdy, adventurous boy with his father's quiet confidence and his mother's determination. When he was 3, Faith gave birth to a daughter they named Sarah, who had Xavier's dark hair and Faith's blue eyes. 2 years after that came another son, James, who seemed to be a perfect blend of both his parents. 3 children, Xavier said one evening, watching as Thomas tried to teach his younger siblings how to rope a fence post. "When did we become those people?" "Somewhere between building a barn and buying our 20th cow." Faith leaned against him, content in a way she had never imagined possible. "Are you complaining?" "Not even slightly, though I will admit I am exhausted. You are not the one who gave birth to them." "A valid point." Xavier pressed a kiss to her temple. "Do you ever think about that day in the canyon, when the Daltons had you trapped and I rode in? Sometimes. It feels like a lifetime ago." "It was a lifetime ago, a whole different life." Xavier pulled her closer. "Do you ever regret it, letting me help?" "Giving up your independence?" Faith turned to look at him. "I did not give up my independence, Xavier. I chose partnership. There is a difference. And no, I have never regretted it, not for a single moment. You are the best decision I ever made. Even better than that seed corn." "Even better than that." Faith laughed. Though the corn was pretty important. They stood there together as the sun set over the Montana mountains, watching their children play and feeling the weight of everything they had built together. The ranch was thriving, their family was healthy and happy, and the future stretched out before them full of promise. "I love you, Faith Rourke," Xavier said, "today and every day for the rest of our lives. I love you too, and I am very glad you refused to let me be alone." Faith reached up and kissed him. "You were right, you know, that first day when you said maybe it was not about what I needed but what I wanted. I wanted you even then. I was just too scared to admit it. And now I am not scared at all. Now I know that wanting someone, needing someone, depending on someone, none of that makes you weak. It makes you human. It makes you whole." Thomas came running up then, breathless and excited, babbling about something he had seen in the pasture. Xavier scooped him up and listened with exaggerated interest, and Faith watched them with a full heart. This was her life now. This was her family. And it was more than she had ever dared to dream. The years continued to pass, marked by the changing seasons and the steady growth of the ranch. Thomas grew tall and strong, taking on more responsibilities as he got older, working beside his father with a dedication that made both Xavier and Faith proud. Sarah proved to have a gift with the horses that rivaled her father's, and by the time she was 10, she could gentle a green-broke colt with patience and skill. James was the dreamer of the family, always with his nose in a book when he could steal time away from chores, talking about becoming a lawyer or maybe a teacher. Xavier's hair started to show gray at the temples when he was in his late 30s, and Faith teased him about it gently. Her own face showed the lines of sun and wind and hard work, but Xavier always said she was more beautiful than the day he met her, and the way he looked at her made it easy to believe. They added onto the house when the children were growing, building 2 more bedrooms and a proper parlor. Faith planted rose bushes along the front that bloomed extravagantly every summer, and Xavier built a porch swing where they would sit in the evenings, watching the sun set and discussing the day's work. "You remember when you told me you needed no one?" Xavier asked one evening when they were both in their early 40s and the children were inside doing homework. "I remember. I also remember you telling me to let you be my want." Faith smiled. "That was either the most romantic or the most ridiculous thing anyone has ever said to me." "Could it not be both?" "I suppose it could." Faith took his hand, lacing their fingers together in the familiar gesture that had become second nature over the years. "You know what the best part is? You became both, my want and my need. I cannot imagine my life without you in it." "Good, because you are stuck with me." Xavier brought her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles. "Forever, Faith, that is how long I plan to love you. Forever sounds perfect." Thomas married at 22, a smart young woman named Elizabeth from a neighboring ranch, and they built a small house on the far end of the Rourke property. He took over more of the daily management of the cattle operation, and Xavier seemed content to step back and let his son take the lead, though he was always available for advice or a hard day's work when needed. Sarah shocked everyone by announcing at 18 that she wanted to start her own horse breeding program, focusing on sturdy working horses for ranchers rather than fancy show animals. Xavier and Faith helped her get started, giving her a section of land and seed money to buy her first breeding stock. Within 3 years, she had a waiting list of customers and a reputation that extended across 3 territories. James did become a lawyer, studying at a school in Denver and returning to Utica to open a small practice. He helped his parents and many of their neighbors with legal matters, and Faith was endlessly proud of him, even though he wore suits instead of working clothes and spent his days with books instead of cattle. When Faith turned 50, Xavier threw her a party that brought together friends and neighbors from across the valley. They celebrated with music and food and dancing, and as Faith looked around at the gathering, at the life they had built and the family they had raised, she felt a sense of contentment so deep it was almost overwhelming. "You did good, Mrs. Rourke," Xavier said, pulling her aside for a moment alone. "Better than good. You built something that will last." "We built it," Faith corrected, just as she always did. "Every bit of it together." "Together," Xavier agreed. "The best word I know." They danced then, swaying to music that drifted from the house, and Faith rested her head on Xavier's shoulder and thought about that desperate woman in a broken wagon who had insisted she needed no one. That woman seemed like a stranger now, someone from a different life. This Faith, the one who had learned to trust and love and build a family, this was who she was always meant to be. "What are you thinking about?" Xavier asked. "About how lucky I am, about how you changed my life." Faith looked up at him. "About how glad I am that you were stubborn enough not to take no for an answer. I had a feeling about you from the first moment I saw you pointing that rifle at me. a feeling that you were worth fighting for, worth staying for, worth everything. Xavier kissed her forehead. I have never regretted following that feeling. Good. Because I plan to keep you around for at least another 50 years. Only 50. I was hoping for longer. They laughed together, and the sound of it carried across the ranch that they had built from nothing but determination and hope and love. The ranch that would pass to their children and their children's children. A legacy of hard work and partnership, and the kind of love that weathers every storm. As the party continued around them, and the Montana sky turned brilliant with stars, Faith thought about the words Xavier had spoken to her that first day. Then, let me be your want. She had fought against those words, had tried so hard to maintain her independence and her walls. But in the end, letting him in had been the bravest and best thing she had ever done, because wanting someone was not weakness. Needing someone was not failure. Love was not a trap but a gift, freely given and gratefully received. And building a life with someone, creating something bigger than either of them could have managed alone, that was not surrender but triumph. Faith Whitmore Rourke had learned those lessons the hard way, through struggle and fear and the gradual erosion of the barriers she had built around her heart. But she had learned them thoroughly, completely, and she had built a life that reflected those truths. A life full of love and family and the satisfaction of work well done. A life that, despite its challenges and hardships, was exactly what she had always needed even when she did not know it. And beside her through all of it had been Xavier, her partner and her love, the man who had refused to let her face the world alone. The man who had seen past her defenses to the lonely, frightened woman beneath, and had offered not pity but partnership. The man who had kept his promises, every single one, for more than 30 years and counting. As they stood together under the vast Montana sky, surrounded by the family and friends they had gathered over a lifetime, Faith squeezed Xavier's hand and smiled. This was happiness, she thought. This was home. This was everything she had never dared to dream of, given freely by a cowboy who had understood that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is not stand alone but reach out and hold on tight to someone who cares. I love you, she whispered. I love you too, Xavier replied. Always and forever. And in that moment, with the music playing and the stars shining and the people they loved gathered close, Faith knew with absolute certainty that they had kept every promise they had made to each other. They had built something that would last, something that mattered, something real and true and worth every moment of struggle it had taken to create. They had built a life together. And it was beautiful.